Police chiefs in Indiana and Illinois, fed up with the crime wave sweeping their states, assembled several elite forces to track down and arrest the members of the most dangerous terror gang. Its core members, John Dillinger, Harry Pete Pierpont, Charles Makeley, John Red Hamilton, and Russell Booby Clark, found the heat on them unbearable. They went on vacation in sunnier climes to cool off. First in Florida, then on to Arizona. The gang had plenty of cash from their previous holdups, but Pierpont, Dillinger, and Hamilton couldn't resist doing one more bank job in East Chicago, Indiana. They were ill-prepared, and their messy getaway ended with the tragic death of Detective Sergeant William Patrick O'Malley and a severely injured John Hamilton. Hamilton and his new girl pet Charrington were left in Fort Wayne, Indiana so he could recover, while the rest of the gang and their gals headed for Tucson, Arizona. They figured they'd be safe from the law in this sleepy old west town. Yeah, they were wrong. I am Yvette, this is Steve Frank History. Thank you for tuning in to episode 5 of the story of John Dillinger, how it started, how it ended, and everything in between. On January 21, 1934, Charles Makeley, Russell Clark, and Opal Long were first to arrive in Tucson, Arizona. Their rented home wasn't ready yet, so they checked in at the Congress, a 3-story hotel. They went clubbing that night, and Clark violated one of the gang's unwritten rules. He talked to outsiders. He got in a bragging match with a few salesmen who claimed they had dynamite. He said, well, they had machine guns, so there. When the salesmen sobered up the next day, they told the local cops. On January 23rd at 7 a.m., an oil overflow of the hotel furnace burst into flames. With no fire stops in the walls, the blaze spread like wildfire. Firefighters were helping hotel guests on the 3rd floor, including Makeley, Clark, and Long, escape down ladders. Once on the ground, the outlaws offered firemen William Benedict and John Freeman a $12 tip to go back up to rescue their luggage. Benedict and Freeman dragged the heavy suitcases to the window. When they prepared to toss them out, Makeley freaked. "Don't throw it!" There were machine guns in there. The tip was mighty generous and mighty suspicious. Later that day, Benedict thumbed through a copy of True Detective magazine. He recognized Clark in an article about John Dillinger. At the sheriff's office, he identified Clark and Makeley on a wanted poster. Tucson Police Chief Gus Wallard, who had just taken a statement from the salesman, put 2 and 2 together and realized some bad puppies had blown into town. He went to the hotel where he got a forwarding address. It was a bust. The gang had gotten spooked and moved to a house close to the University of Arizona. The owner, Mrs. Hattie Strauss, was impressed by Mr. Davies, aka Makeley, a well-dressed, smooth-talking businessman. However, "I think I've seen you before, or I've seen your picture." Makeley smiled and denied he'd ever been in the news or in Tucson. Meanwhile, the agents of the Bureau of Investigation had also traced the gang to Tucson through mail sent to Russell Clark by a family member. The G-men notified Police Chief Wallard about the gang, confirming the salesman and fireman stories. Bad puppies indeed. On January 24th, the day after the fire, Johnny Dillinger rolled into town with his girl Billie Frechette and her puppy. They registered at the close-in motel at the Arizona Tourist Court as Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan. A few hours later, Harry Pierpont, wearing rimless glasses with plain lenses as a disguise, and his gal, Mary Kinder, checked into a cabin at the same tourist camp. After unpacking, they went for a drive in Pete's new 1934 tan Buick with Florida plates. He thought someone was following him and pulled over to talk to 2 cops who stood at a box phone on 18th Street, motor officers Milo Sweet Walker and Earl Mickey Nolan. He introduced himself as J.C. Evans and told them he thought he was being followed. This was Pierpont's standard protocol. Whenever he thought police tailed him, he would tell a policeman, which, if there was an actual tail, always broke it up. Nolan hopped on his motorcycle and chased after the suspicious car. He returned a few minutes later. It was just a young man with containers in the car. He was looking for water for his mother, who did laundry for a living. Nolan and Walker reassured the well-dressed, timid man, whom they thought was a college professor, that he was perfectly safe in Tucson. Pierpont chatted a few minutes about the fine climate while they admired his new wheels and his fancy car radio. Walker commented that it was the first car radio he'd ever seen. Dumbass Harry then said truthfully that he was staying at the close-in motel on South 6th Avenue. "What is wrong with you?" When the couple returned home, Mary heard a dog barking in the adjoining cabin. "Isn't that Billy's puppy?" Pierpont was like, "Nah man, no way." A moment later, there was a familiar knock on the door. "I recognized your Buick, Pete." It was Dillinger. On January 25th, Russell Clark and Opal Long had lunch with Charles Makeley and his date May Miller, a local nightclub singer, at the Strauss home. Chief of Detectives Dallas Ford, Detective Chester Sherman, and Sergeant Mark Robbins were watching the house from a parked car. Captain Jay Smith and Sergeant Frank Quick Draw Amon were in the bushes, keeping an eye on Makeley's new Studebaker parked in the driveway. The policeman had done some excellent sleuthing and had gotten this address from a delivery guy who had hauled the gangster's luggage there from the hotel. At 1:30 p.m., Makeley left the house with Miss Miller, hopped into the Studebaker, and went to the Grabby Electric and Radio store downtown to pick up a radio. The cops tailed them, and Detective Sherman, in plain clothes, followed them into the store. He grabbed the manager, Bruce Hanna, and flashed his ID. Could he check if the customer had an index finger missing on his left hand? The manager checked. Yup, missing finger. And so, Sherman, Ford, Amon, and Robbins confronted the unarmed Makeley, who acted all confused. "He was J.C. Davies. Return to the house with me and I'll prove it." The officers took him to the police station instead, where Makeley was charged as a fugitive from justice. His date was released. Next. Captain Kenneth Mullaney, Chief of Detectives Ford, Detective Sherman, and Sergeant Amon, all dressed in civilian clothes, parked in an alley half a block away from the Strauss home. After an hour of nothing, Sherman, small enough to pass for a messenger boy, put on a Western Union cap and went to the house holding a piece of paper. Amon and Mullaney were ready to break down the back door, while Ford waited across the street to back up Sherman. Sherman rang the doorbell. Russell Clark took a quick look. That kid at the door was no cop. Still, he snuck into the bedroom with his beer while Opal answered the door. Sherman said he had a letter for Mr. Long. When Opal reached for it, he insisted on delivering it personally. Clark appeared, and Sherman drew his gun. But the big gangster seized it by the barrel and yanked the small man inside. Ford came running, but Opal slammed the door on him, breaking the chief's finger. Clark and Sherman wrestled their way to the bedroom, with Opal hitting the officer, unleashing a fantastic selection of profanities. Once on the bed, Clark reached under the pillow for his gun on a wire, but it wasn't there. Opal had put it under the mattress as a precaution. Sherman hit Clark on the head with a gun, but not hard enough to knock the outlaw out. Meanwhile, Ford had busted through the front door and was instantly caught in a fierce fight with Opal. Then Amon and Mullaney broke down the back door. Amon tried to hit Clark on the head but struck Sherman instead. Sherman shook it off. When Clark saw Opal fighting Ford, he let go of the gun. Sherman hit him on the head with it for good measure. Opal and a severely injured Clark, bleeding all over the place, were cuffed and hauled to the station. Police searched the house and found a large chunk of cash, 4 Thompsons, a pair of steel vests, 2 .45 Colt automatics, ammunition, handcuffs, and brass knuckles. Then the Tucson police, not as experienced as their Chicago counterparts, made a boo-boo. They left no one at the Strauss home. So they missed Harry Pierpont, who arrived an hour later. Pete found the door open. Anyone home? No. But there were bloodstains and toppled furniture. Trouble. Pierpont got back in his car and raced to the Arizona Tourist Court, where he and Mary packed their bags and prepared to beat town. They had no way to warn Dillinger he was out with Billy making a down payment on a rental home on 1304 East 5th Street. Pierpont quickly called a local lawyer to represent a Mr. Davies and a Mrs. Long, who may or may not have those names and may or may not have been picked up by the police. Figure it out. Toodles. Those at police headquarters were just discussing that weird college professor incident from a few days ago when a neighbor from the Strauss place called into the station to warn them a tall stranger went into the house but ran outside seconds later and took off in a 1934 Buick. They instantly knew the professor was Harry Pierpont. Where did he say he was staying again? Ah yes, the Close-In Motel at the Arizona Tourist Court. Next. Captain J. Smith, Sergeant Frank Amon, and Earl Mickey Nolan were on their way to the tourist camp to have a little chat with J.C. Evans when they noticed a Buick with Florida plates sitting at a light at an intersection. They pulled the car over. Amon got out and thought fast. He wanted to avoid a shootout and simply convinced the gangster to come with him to the police station peacefully. So he did his best Hattie partner impression and asked the driver for his driver's license. Pierpont, a .45 in his left hand, relaxed, moved the gun under his leg, and decided to bluff it out. He showed his license with a fake name. Amon was like, "Yeah, see, I don't mean to be a drag, but y'all need a visitor's inspection sticker. You're gonna get pulled over by every traffic cop in town, so why don't I just hop on in and ride with you to the police station, and I'll get you guys sorted right there so y'all can be back on the road in no time. What do you say?" Pierpont agreed. Amon quickly slid into the back seat, which was filled with luggage. He plunked his butt down a suitcase containing a machine gun, several revolvers, a bulletproof vest, and ammunition. He noticed Pierpont adjusting his rear-view mirror to keep an eye on him and the trailing patrol car. Amon kept chatting. He praised the local climate. He'd come here for his wife's health. And then he threw a casual glance back. Police car was gone. He slipped out his gun, careful to keep it from view. Pierpont, suspecting nothing, parked in front of the police station. Mary remained in the car as Pierpont and Amon strolled inside to get him that sticker. When the duo entered Chief Waller's office, Pierpont caught a glimpse of Makeley's and Clark's luggage and their guns on Waller's desk. It's a trap. Harry swung around and drew his .38 Super from his shoulder holster under his left arm. Quick draw, Amon drew faster. Drop it. Pierpont dropped the .38, but his right hand reached for a second gun stuck in his belt fast. Amon, again faster, rammed his gun in Pierpont's ribs while Chief Wallet and J. Smith went for the outlaw's arms. His glasses fell and shattered. Tucson police patted him down and found $95.81 and 2 more weapons, including Sheriff Jess Sarber's .38 in his sock. Dumbass had held on to the smoking gun. During Pete's booking, they took everything out of his pockets and put it on the counter of the desk sergeant so he could list all of his property. When Pierpont saw a piece of paper, he reached over and grabbed it, shoved it in his mouth, and started chewing it. Officer Harry Foley noticed. Walker remembered. That damn Foley, he was gonna get it out of there, so he goes in with his finger and got the hell bit out of him. An iron claw was put on Harry's arm and tightened. Finally, the pain was too much and Pete spat out the paper. The writing was blurred, but Amon made out 1304 East 5th, the house Dillinger rented that day. The officers charged Pierpont with resisting an officer. Pierpont, disarmed and in handcuffs, turned his burning gaze to each lawman. "I'll get you and you and you. I can get out of any jail and I'll remember you. I'll be back." Mary, who was still in the car, was arrested without a struggle. During her booking, she was relieved of her diamond watch, 3 rings, necklaces, and $3,118.95 in cash. Makeley and Clark had carried nearly $7,500, most of it stuffed into their money belts. Amon left to investigate the house on East 5th, but plainclothesman James Herron suggested they return to the Strauss home in case anyone else showed up there. Chief Waller told him to pick the man he wanted. Herron chose Captain Kenneth Mullaney and Sweet Walker. Next. Across town, Johnny and Billy, still blissfully unaware that things were going down in Tucson, drove to the cabins and found no one at Pierpont's place. Happens. They should check Makeley's place. Meanwhile, James Herron, Kenneth Mullaney, and Sweet Walker pulled up to the Strauss home. The officers entered through the busted back door, but once inside, they realized that their car out front might scare off potential prey. Herron moved the car into a driveway across the street just as Johnny and Billy drove by. Dillinger made a U-turn and parked in front of the house. It was 6:30 p.m. and the house was dark. Dillinger figured he was probably at the wrong address and left Billy and the puppy in the Hudson while he went to check. He jogged up the steps. Then, footsteps behind him. Johnny turned, thinking it was Makeley. It was Herron. Herron casually asked, "Who are you looking for?" Dillinger started back toward the Hudson. "Yeah, I'm at the wrong house." Heron pulled his weapon. "Yeah, you're not." Before Dillinger could react, Walker kicked open the screen door and shouted, "Stick 'em up!" Dillinger protested that he was Frank Sullivan, a businessman from Green Bay, Wisconsin, but his .45 suggested otherwise. The outlaw wasn't wearing a bulletproof vest and realized it was over. He slowly raised his hands. Walker kept his shotgun trained on Dillinger while Heron searched him. Walker remembers, "I was covering Dillinger with a shotgun, and he would only raise his hands shoulder high until I pulled back the hammer on the shotgun. Reach for the moon or I'll cut you in two." Then he raised his hands over his head. At this time we searched him and found he was carrying two guns, .45 automatic and a .38 Super. Walker ordered Billy out of the car. She had to clasp her hands together and put them on her head. Dillinger was furious. How dare they treat a lady that way? In the Hudson, the officers found 2 Thompsons, 500 rounds of ammunition, and 2 shortwave radios. The police drove Frank Sullivan securely handcuffed in the back seat to headquarters. The cops had no idea they'd caught John Dillinger, just a bad puppy. At the station, Sullivan was relieved of $6,875 in his belt. Billy gave her name as Anna Martin and had to hand over $67.97. She was held for the U.S. government, an allusion to her status as an American Indian. At his newly rented house, cops confiscated $6,500 from a suitcase, $1,000 from a locked closet, and 2 modified Winchester .351 rifles fitted with custom foregrips and impressive Maxim silencers. At the station, Sergeant Mark Robbins positively identified Makeley, Clark, and Pierpont from their fingerprints. Dillinger still insisted he was Frank Sullivan. Sergeant Robbins examined a stack of pictures, then held one up. "Look who we have here." He checked Sullivan's left wrist, a scar. He found another under Sullivan's mustache. "Hello, John Dillinger." Robbins handed him the fingerprint card and said, "Here, John, you might as well sign your real name here." Dillinger flashed his patented bravado grin but was seething at being so easily captured. He asked, "How did you know I was in town?" What a laugh, to be picked up by a bunch of hick cops. Johnny was charged as a fugitive from justice. Searching the bandit again, another $200 was discovered in the lining of his coat. The station was too small to hold the big bad men, Walker recalled. "We called over to the Pima County Sheriff's Department, and they sent deputies Orris Shin and Jerry Martin to pick up Dillinger to take him over to the county jail. When they started out the door, they didn't handcuff him or anything. Mickey Nolan warned them, 'Hey fellas, you better handcuff that man because he isn't any ordinary criminal.' One of the deputies said, 'Well, let the son of a bitch run. That's what we want. Then we can shoot him in the back and save the county money.' The ladies, Mary, Billy, and Opal, were sent upstairs to the women's section on the penthouse floor. Heavily armed guards were stationed throughout the facility. Border Patrol agents were bussed in for additional manpower. The no-nonsense Sheriff John Belton told each crook that if anybody tried to break them out, they'd be the first to die. 'You're worth just as much to me dead as alive, and I don't intend to get a bunch of good men killed just to see you get away.' A special APB went out nationwide for John Hamilton, the only remaining Inner Circle member still at large. If anyone was gonna break the gang out, Hamilton would lead it. Another APB was sent for Hilton Crouch, until Indiana officials let Tucson know that he was behind bars in Michigan City. In a mere 5 hours, the Tucson hick cops had captured John Dillinger and his entire Inner Circle, seized their weapons, and confiscated $27,000 of their stolen money. How embarrassing for the armies of Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio in up-armored cars that they had done it without firing a single shot and at the cost of a broken finger. Though the arrests were called random and remarkable, this was good old-fashioned police work. But Tucson police had one great ally to thank, the gang's own full sense of security. Dillinger said, "You were awfully lucky, but you worked it right. Where you were smart was getting us one at a time. If you had gone in that house when Clark and Makeley were both there, it would have been too bad. There were guns in the back room. It would have been a fight. Some of us might have been shot, but some of you would have been shot too." A routine search at the jail uncovered another $2,000 in Dillinger's belt. They joked that every time the bandits were shaken down, it rained money. Some of that rain was toxic. Serial numbers on $25 bills were traced back to the First National Bank of East Chicago. Dillinger might as well have been carrying slain Sergeant O'Malley's revolver. The Tucson police were happy. The terror gang had not done anything wrong in Arizona, but they had outstanding warrants in several states, and some states offered large rewards. But who would get them? With Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, and Wisconsin all demanding the gangsters be extradited to their states, a bidding war began. Arizona didn't care who got the gangsters. No reward, no extradition. Most officers wanted the state with the largest reward to win the bidding war. That would be Wisconsin. On Friday morning, January 26, 1934, the day after the capture, the prisoners and their women were arraigned before Justice of the Peace C.V. Budlong. Newsmen flocked to interview the arresting officers and photograph the cars, money, and weapons put on display. As per usual, the guns in most cars would end up in the service of the Tucson Police Department. Inside the courtroom, 30 armed deputies lined the walls. There was no room for all the curious townfolk, so many stood in the corridors and even on the lawn. They gasped, then shuddered in fear as the 4 infamous men were brought in manacled together. The men crooks were followed by the unshackled women crooks. John Dillinger, whose name was always mispronounced as Dillinger, had become a national household name. He reveled in all the attention. Justice Budlong ordered Dillinger to stand up, but the gangster merely slumped farther into his seat and growled, "I ain't Dillinger." A clerk yanked him to his feet. "Punk." Russell Clark said little, but Harry Pierpont kept a running commentary and had to be silenced several times. Makeley scornfully denied the accusation that he and Dillinger had been involved in the Edward Bremer kidnapping in St. Paul, Minnesota a week earlier. He was an honest-to-God bank robber and wanted nothing to do with the snatch racket. The terror gang had hired Tucson attorney John Van Buskirk. He entered a not guilty plea for all of them. County prosecutor Clarence Houston asked the court to hold the gangsters without bail. Van Buskirk protested, citing the Arizona Constitution's clause on reasonable bail. The men hadn't committed a crime in Arizona. Budlong glanced at the huge collection of confiscated guns and said that the gangsters were certainly entitled to a reasonable bail, $100,000 each. The ladies could free themselves for a mere $5,000 each. Van Buskirk told the judge that he would fight extradition, get the bonds reduced, and file a habeas corpus writ to determine whether their detention was even lawful. The robbers couldn't use the confiscated cash to post bail because bank officials, attorneys, and insurance companies were already laying claims. Still, to delay the claims process, the gang signed the money and their cars over to Van Buskirk to cover his legal fee. As the defendants left the courtroom, Johnny and Billy exchanged smiles. He leaned over, gave her a kiss, and whispered, "Keep hold of yourself, honey. They've got nothing on you. We'll all get out of this yet." The ladies in the audience swooned. Oh, that's not good. Dillinger had fans. Newspaper reporters struggled to downplay these scenes. These are bad men. Tough when holding a machine gun, cowards when faced with determined lawmen. Gunslinging desperados belonged in the bygone frontier days. The modern world embraced honest, hard-working men, putting in their 9-to-5s to make the world better, happier, safer, and more comfortable. They were the real heroes, the embodiment of the true American dream, which was, well, a little tone-deaf considering it was still the Great Depression and few men actually had jobs, but sure. It soon became clear that society as a whole wasn't prepared to move on from the adventurous outlaws. Indiana State Police Captain Matt Leach and his 5-member team boarded the train for Tucson. He brought fingerprint clerk Mary Grott along to handle the ladies. Also on this junket was William Tubby Toms, an Indianapolis news reporter and Leach's biggest fan. The captain vowed to bring the gang back by train and brought the $325 in Indiana reward money, $100 each for the escaped convicts and $25 for Dillinger as a parole violator. At the Indianapolis train station, Matt Leach told newsmen, "This stamps out the so-called Dillinger gang. That's all of them. We have 2 important characters, Dillinger and Pierpont. The curtain closes down on them." The custody battle seemed settled later that day. Ohio prosecutor Ernest Bodkin said they'd get Pierpont, Makeley, and Clark, who had been identified as the killers of Sheriff Jess Sarber in Lima. Indiana could have Dillinger, but Wisconsin was like, incoming! They had a bone to pick with the gang over the Racine Bank robbery. They boasted their fancy justice system in which criminals could be tried, sentenced, and locked up in the state prison all on the same day. Their courts were corruption-free, and there would be no spectacular escapes from Waupun prison. But Ohio insisted murder trumped bank robbery. Indiana insisted the same. But Captain Leach wanted them all. They've been my babies for so many months that I've figuratively eaten and slept with them. And fight or no fight, I will bring them back. Missouri then came screeching in from left field, demanding Dillinger for a silly farm wife kidnapping he had nothing to do with. Yeah, you can have a seat. Once news spread that the core of the terror gang was caught, the national media hustled to Tucson, Arizona. Reporters, press photographers, and motion picture cameramen from Pathé, Movietone, and Universal Newsreel all headed for the desert. Harry Pierpont tried to shield his face from the flash bulbs, but a couple of cops grabbed him and forced him to pose. The gang was allowed to speak to the media, who were greedy for quotes and headlines. They mostly complained and ranted and claimed they'd get out, one way or another. Charles Makeley, sometimes called the hardest convict of the gang, was mostly embarrassed for his family. They were not like me. They were honest, at least, even if never rich. Look at my dad. He worked like the devil all his life, and what did he get out of it? I have lived as long in 40 minutes at times as my dad did in 40 years. Newspaper editors-in-chief thanked the Lord on their knees that John Dillinger was super quotable. I'm an expert in my business. I can play tag with the police anytime. They just dodge around the old trails like foxhounds that don't know what's going on. And the dumbest ones in the world are the Chicago kind. Right now, none of those smart aleck coppers have got a bit of evidence that I killed anybody or robbed any bank. And they can't keep me penned up anywhere, here, Atlanta, Leavenworth, or Alcatraz Island, any more than they can keep my men in Ohio or Indiana. It must be noted, however, not to blindly trust the press when it comes to quotes. The editors printed anything to sell newspapers and often put words into the gangsters' mouths to create bigger and more evil personas. And they were confused. It happened that a newspaper vilified Dillinger on one page, and on the other called him quite jovial, easy to talk to, polite. Or like the Tucson Citizen described him, suave, soft-spoken, more like an academic professor than a hunted outlaw. The prisoners got a visit from the arresting officers, Frank Amon and Chester Sherman. Amon brought along Billy's puppy to let the boys play with it. Ah, that's sweet. Pierpont slow-clapped Amon's ruse with the Arizona license sticker. That polite police act had him fooled. Also, thanks for not shooting me. There are two kinds of officers, rats and gentlemen. You fellows are gentlemen, and the Indiana and Ohio cops are rats. If all this had happened in Ohio, we'd be laying on a slab. They'd have murdered us. On January 27, 1934, Team Indiana's train from wintry Indianapolis arrived in sunny Tucson. Team Chicago, Illinois, with Captain John Steege of the Dillinger Squad and Night Watch Sergeant Frank Reynolds arrived at the same time. Leach's enemies, Team East Chicago, arrived by mail plane. They were Lake County Prosecutor Robert Estill, the East Chicago Chief of Police Nicholas McCarr, Chief Deputy Sheriff of Lake County Carol Hawley, and Hobart Wilgus, the East Chicago patrol officer who had witnessed Dillinger shoot Officer O'Malley. Estill hated Leach because he suspected that the captain had blabbed to the press about the prosecutor's supposed ties with the East Chicago and Gary mobs. Estill got all Lake County law enforcement ranks, including those at East Chicago and Crown Point, to turn against the state police captain. Robert Estill, a calm man in public, a beast in the courtroom, was determined to send Dillinger to the electric chair. He was angling for Indiana governorship, and a conviction of such a formidable outlaw would put a big feather in his cap. Captain Matt Leach barely took time to wash up and went straight to the county jail and made a beeline for Dillinger's cell. Well, we meet again, John. He extended his hand to Johnny, who reluctantly shook it. When Leach advised him to waive, which is to agree to extradition to Indiana, Dillinger smiled. I'm in no hurry to return to Indiana. I haven't a thing to do when I get there. Leach went to Makeley's cell, who looked past the captain and asked his jailer, "Can't you do something about these bunks to get rid of these bugs?" Then Leach stepped up to Pierpont's cell, who was silent for a moment, and then suddenly exploded with rage. Indiana Star reporter Joseph Shepard witnessed the explosion. An infuriated tiger, Harry Pierpont, a caged but untamed Indiana desperado, leaped like a madman to the bars of his cell here today. When he glanced into the eyes of the man he hates worst in the world, Captain Matt Leach, chief of the Indiana State Police. The glance lashed him into insane rage in the fraction of a second. His eyes glared wildly, veins in his neck stood out like purple vines, and saliva dripped from his lips. He mouthed only futile impotence as he tried to form words. Then words came. Torrents of blasphemy and oaths, accusations and invectives screeched at the top of his lungs, petrified the little group of officers who had escorted Leach to his first peep at the men he has hounded for months. The spectators drew back, leaving Leach alone and silent, standing at the bars. The reporter didn't want to repeat what he said, but others did. "You dirty son of a bitch! There's only one thing I regret. I came to Indianapolis to kill you and had the gun on you and then didn't do it. You threw my old mother in jail to make her tell you where I was. I'll never forget that. When I get out of here, the first thing I'm gonna do is kill you, you rat." Sheriff Belton told him to calm down. Hadn't he been treated well in Tucson? "I've got nothing against you or any police, but that. He glared at Leach until he finally withdrew. Leach shrugged and said to a reporter, "There's a man who really loves his mother." The captain calmly told Pierpont that Terre Haute PD had made the arrests and that he wanted to keep Pierpont's mom free to trap handsome Harry himself. That afternoon, John Dillinger was in a belligerent mood, refusing to talk to reporters. He answered all their questions by shaking a tin cup holding coins. Only Tubby Toms of the Indianapolis News got a friendly reception. Dillinger relaxed and even smiled when Toms relayed a quote from John Dillinger Sr. "I feel relieved. I don't believe they have a thing on him in any of these killings. I kinda hoped John would get out of the country before he got caught, but maybe this way is best. I was so afraid that when they tried to close in on him, he would shoot somebody, or would get shot in some way. I couldn't bear to think of that." Dillinger Jr. responded, "Dad's a good old scout. I wish for his sake I'd taken up some other line of business. I'm sorry I've caused him so much worry, but well, that's just how life goes. We can't all be angels." As a present for being considerate to his family, the outlaw reached into his pocket and gave Toms his rabbit's foot. "Here, you might as well have this. My luck's running out anyway." Tubby noted that the foot was quite fresh. Dillinger grinned and said he'd killed a rabbit at Mooresville about 2 weeks ago. "I shot him out of season. I guess I'm just a born criminal." Dillinger then asked the assembled reporters to urge their readers to vote for Sheriff John Belton in the next election. Smart move. The flattery worked. Belton beamed when he heard about the endorsement and dropped his tough guy act a notch. In the penthouse, Billy was allowed to entertain the press hounds as well. "Isn't he grand? He's always that way, rain or shine. You can't help but love a man like that." Arizona Governor Benjamin Baker Moore, recognizing a photo op when he saw one, arrived at the cell block to look at the catch. He got a cool reception. Dillinger, no longer interested in publicity, just glared at the governor. Pierpont smiled and said, "I'm sorry to see you in jail too, Governor." Makeley and Moore had a nice chat, discussing the weather, the old Pueblo, and mutual friends in Phoenix and Indianapolis. He said, "When I get out of here, I'll be hotter than ever." Then added, "I may get out. I've gotten out before." Justice Budlong heard that the Dillinger gang moles might make bail. They could then bail out the men from the hidden cash stash. So he raised the bonds on Mary and Opal to $100,000. Oddly, Queen Mall Billy Frechette's bond was kept at a low $5,000. That night, Sheriff Belton decided, what the heck, open house, which is not at all increasing the risk of a jailbreak. But the sheriff figured this would help with the women voters. 415 visitors paraded through in groups of 15 to gawk at the superstar villains like caged monkeys in a zoo. An enraged Pierpont put on a violent and obscene show. The audience got their money's worth. Not so much with Dillinger, who mostly ignored them, until one woman stepped up and said, "Your mother must be ashamed of you." Dillinger snapped back in a loud voice, "I don't have a mother." The lady jumped back. The next day, another 1,100 people lined up for the show. It all ended abruptly when Captain Leach waved a telegram from one of his lieutenants back home, saying that 2 carloads of heavily armed men were seen in Illinois speeding westward. At the Pima County Court, Prosecutor Estill and Chief McCarr demanded that John Dillinger be extradited to Indiana's Lake County. Captain Leach raged that Dillinger should go to a maximum security prison, not some county jail. He got into a shouting match with McCarr, who had brought several of his thug-like officers from the East Chicago and Indiana Harbor Police Force. The captain and the chief stood nose to nose until someone pulled them apart. Indiana Governor Paul McNutt, though protective of his captain, told Leach to listen to Estill. Fine, as long as they came back to Indiana. Well, Wisconsin had a thing or two to say about that. The 3 members of Team Wisconsin, headed up by District Attorney John Brown, told the gang's lawyer, Van Buskirk, "We don't have the death penalty. Your client should want to come with us." The press went mad. Man killers ought to be executed. Arizona prosecutor Clarence Houston said, "To hell with Wisconsin. I wouldn't hand the gang over to that state's officials under any consideration." Naturally, the gang was on their best behavior when the Wisconsin delegates visited them. On January 29th, the 4 men signed waivers of extradition to Wisconsin. Police Chief Wallard and Justice Budlong agreed to the deal as long as Wisconsin paid the reward money. Team Wisconsin showed the men $6,000 and sweetened the pot by saying they'd paid the Tucson arresting officers to escort the prisoners to their fine state. Naturally, that put Tucson PD in Team Wisconsin's corner. When Team Indiana, Team Illinois, and Team Ohio found out about Team Wisconsin's deal, they went nuts. Now the political bigwigs got involved, with all the governors calling each other. Prosecutor Estill told County Attorney Houston they had to stop Team Wisconsin and quickly get all 4 male prisoners to Indiana. Governor Moore only had to sign Dillinger's extradition papers, since the 3 others were escapees from Indiana State Prison. The Arizona governor awarded custody to Indiana with the understanding that Dillinger would remain in Indiana, while the other 3 would be transferred to Ohio once Captain Leach was through with them. However, Estill was worried. Van Buskirk's writ of habeas corpus could delay the process, which could give Team Wisconsin time to appeal extradition. Estill suggested they sneak all the gangsters out of town by plane before Van Buskirk could file a writ. The standard method of moving prisoners across country was by train. Prosecutor Houston said it would only be possible to slip one of them out, John Dillinger. Leach could take Pierpont, Clark, and Megley to Indiana by train. Leach, armed with Governor Moore's extradition papers, got Wisconsin's governor, Albert George Schmiedman, to torpedo Team Wisconsin's deal. Schmiedman agreed to waive all claims to Dillinger. Good talk. The local police officers were furious that John Dillinger was given to Indiana and not to the state promising the largest reward, Wisconsin. While they argued with Prosecutor Houston upstairs, downstairs Sheriff Belton told Dillinger he was going home. Pierpont yelled, "They're not taking you to Indiana, they're putting you on the spot, boy." Dillinger, wild-eyed and frightened, retreated to the back of the cell. "You're shanghaiing me! Where is my lawyer? He told me this was illegal. They can't take me back east without a hearing." The sheriff and his deputies shoved him against the wall. Johnny fought back, but they brought his arms behind him, slapped on the handcuffs, and pulled him from his cell. Dillinger said, "I won't forget it. I'll come back here and get the whole damn bunch of you." Everything was done so quickly that even the crowd around the courthouse never saw him leave. The outlaw wasn't the only one who was surprised by Estill's move. The gang's lawyer, Van Buskirk, had just convinced the judge for a writ of habeas corpus to be heard the next morning. Now one of his clients, Dillinger, had left the building. He was mad! Leach heard while he was at the local Elks Club. He was mad! Okay, everyone was mad. Well, not Estill. He was in the car with Johnny and gleefully noticed that at every turn the handcuffs dug deeper into Dillinger's wrists. The outlaw turned white and was bathed in sweat. If his fans could see him now. At the airfield, a crowd had gathered to watch Air Force planes land when they noticed a bunch of cops and officers leading a shackled man fighting like a mad animal to a Bellanca monoplane. Dillinger was forced to squat at Chief Bakar's feet with one leg cuffed to a post behind the pilot's seat. He smirked. "Hell, I don't jump out of these things." At the courthouse, reporters, still unaware of John Dillinger's sudden departure, were following up on a tragic love story. Harry Pierpont knew that once he was held on capital murder charges, only a wife could visit him in prison. He asked Sheriff Belton if he could get married to Mary Kinder. Belton kicked in the $2 fee for the marriage license, but Justice Budlong blew Pierpont off. He stated that Mary was married to Dale Kinder. She wasn't. She'd gotten divorced 7 months earlier. However, she wasn't interested in marrying Pierpont. Her divorced husband was still living. Besides, she and Pierpont were just good friends. Did the dude just get friend-zoned in prison? Pierpont blamed Captain Leach for the cancelled wedding. Later that afternoon, a mentally handicapped prisoner who was allowed to roam the courtyard freely appeared under Mary's window. He'd been carrying messages to and from Pierpont for the last few days. He kept saying, "Bird, bird, bird, bird." Mary finally understood what he meant. Who were they taking by plane? One John already gone. What about Harry Pierpont? He's still here. He and Makeley and Clark go to Ohio. Mary was silent for a moment. Then, oh my God. Attorney Van Buskirk was outraged over his client's kidnapping. Team Wisconsin even more so. Everyone blamed the universally hated Captain Leach. Everybody, take a number. Racine prosecutor John Brown, who had already joined the I Hate Leach line, said, "Indiana State, which turned these mobsters loose on the Middle West, has Dillinger in custody again. It is hoped that the negligence of the officer of that state will never be repeated." Meanwhile, at Tucson Airport, the Bellanca took off, followed by a chase plane with East Chicago police officer Hobart Wilgus and prosecutor Robert Estell on board. About 10:30 p.m., the plane carrying John Dillinger landed in a field 100 miles southwest of Tucson, known as the International Airport at Douglas, Arizona. At the Douglas police station, Johnny was stripped, forced to change clothes, and driven back to the airport. 45 minutes later, Dillinger and his escort climbed aboard a twin-engine Curtiss Condor airliner for a scheduled American Airways flight to El Paso, Texas. One of the two passengers on board took one look at Dillinger and was like, "No, thank you," and left the plane. Dillinger was bored and chatted with Estell. He admitted to robbing the Greencastle and East Chicago banks. He even confessed to killing O'Malley and then said he would deny it on the stand, of course. It was self-defense. He was going to stop us. He shot first. It snowed in El Paso when the plane touched down. As they deboarded, Estell saw Dillinger shiver in his shirt sleeves and put his spare jacket over the gangster's shoulders. Johnny was puzzled about his humanity. The plane carrying the Public Enemy had 3 more layovers in Texas alone, in Abilene, Fort Worth, and Dallas. Aviator Charles Lindbergh may have crossed the Atlantic in 1927. Commercial air travel wasn't very good yet. Commercial jets' top speed was 100 miles an hour, barely faster than a gangster's Terraplane or Ford V8. But the plane had a stewardess who handed out gum for the altitude pressure, cotton balls against the noise, and beverages. In Memphis, Tennessee, Johnny was escorted to a Ford high-wing tri-motor to St. Louis, Missouri. Saul Davies, a clever Chicago Times photographer, bought all 4 remaining tickets and prevented his rivals from boarding the flight. He pestered the tired outlaw to pose for photos. "All right, kid, what the hell? Go ahead and shoot." He also asked Johnny questions. "How'd this happen, John?" "Oh, some dumb clock slipped up." "The brakes aren't coming your way, huh?" "These bastards won't give me a break. I was supposed to be brought before the Tucson judge, then those pricks nabbed me. I wish I'd had 5 seconds. "Why 5 seconds? If I'd had those 5 seconds, they wouldn't have taken me that way." Davies kept going, but Dillinger, media savvy as he was, felt he was wasting time. "I thought you was a cameraman. What the hell's the use of me answering all these questions over again? Go away, let me sleep." Davies, proud of his historic photo series, said, "I served a long stretch in the Army and I met plenty of tough guys, but I don't think I ever met a tougher one than Dillinger." Meanwhile, back in Tucson, just before 10 a.m. on January 30th, 1934, the remaining 3 gangsters were taken to the Packed Superior Court. John Dillinger's hasty removal had been unnecessary. The judge denied the writ of habeas corpus. Billy Frechette and Opal Long were released as unwitting moles. They gladly accepted the insult, and after Billy reclaimed her puppy, hopped on the first bus out of town. After a short argument, Indiana Attorney General Philip Lutz Jr. secured legal possession of the rest of the gang. Captain Matt Leach hustled everyone to the train station. Makeley, passing a pack of furious Wisconsin officials, said, "I'm sorry, you lost." At the South Pacific Railroad terminal, a crowd of 1,500 watched as 35 machine-gun-toting deputies encircled the platform, where the cops and robbers boarded a chartered Pullman car. Time for one more dramatic chapter before the train left the station. Arresting officers Chet Sherman and Frank Amon wanted to join the prisoners, but Deputy Sheriff Maurice Guinea stopped them. The Tucson officers blamed Captain Leach for not getting the $2,500 each Wisconsin had promised. When Leach handed Sherman and Amon a $100 bill each, they were livid. Sherman grabbed Leach by the collar and shouted, "You're everything Pierpont said you were, a double-crossing rat." Leach remembered the painful event. "They called me such names as I almost pulled my gun on them. No man ever called me such things in all my life. It was more than any man could endure." Later, the 2 Tucson officers came to Indiana to apologize for their rudeness. At 10:55 a.m., the Golden State Limited chugged out of the station. Leach allowed Kinder to sit with Pierpont, who finally mellowed a bit. Handsome Harry was already planning an escape. He made sure newsmen knew that John Hamilton had died from his wounds and had been tossed into the Calumet River. His claims sent police, dragnet boats, and divers out searching for him, but they'd never find Hamilton. The man was alive and recovering, but not yet fit enough to organize a breakout. The cons on a train thundered through Arizona, New Mexico, and Kansas and attracted huge crowds at every stop. Pierpont, Makeley, Clark, and Little Mary were almost the biggest thing going. Almost. Because the biggest thing going was about to land in Chicago, Illinois. On January 30th, 1934, at 6:10 p.m., the American Airways plane landed at Chicago's Municipal Airport. A grand convoy greeted the public enemy to escort him to the Allen County Jail in Crown Point, Indiana. 32 members of Captain Steege's Dillinger squad, clad in armor and carrying machine guns and shotguns, 60 additional Chicago policemen, and 29 members of the Indiana State Police. Dillinger Squad Sergeant Frank Itchy Triggerfinger Reynolds pulled Dillinger toward a caravan of cars. "You yellow son of a bitch, if anyone tries to stop us, you'll be the first dead man." Prosecutor Estill generously handed his prisoner $10 pocket money. Johnny was then shackled to 2 Indiana officers and shoved into the back of Reynolds' car. Reynolds rode shotgun and looked back at the prisoner. "Just start something." Dillinger, who had threatened the man so often over the phone, said nothing. Captain Steege wanted to shoot Dillinger at the airport where he stood, but there were too many people. He considered pulling over on the side of the road to shoot the prisoner doing a fake escape, but too many press hounds snapped at their heels. Oh well. The massive law enforcement caravan with 13 cars and a dozen motorcyclists drove to Crown Point, the seat of Lake County, Indiana. Sirens were on all the way. Some cars had blinding searchlights sweeping along the roads to deter hidden bandits trying to break Dillinger free. But crowds were gathered along the entire route, and it was useless. Dillinger didn't care for the welcome parade. His 8 months of freedom would end in a life sentence or the electric chair. Nothing to sneeze at. When the convoy passed the Indiana border, more cars with cops from Hammond, East Chicago, and Gary joined the officers en route to Crown Point, making 150 officers in all. In Mooresville, John Dillinger Sr. worried about leaving the farm and make the long trips to the Crown Point jail. He told reporters that he didn't have any clean shirts for such a trip. "Of course, I could buy a shirt." At 7:35 that evening, the shrieking caravan arrived at the Lake County Jail in Crown Point, Indiana. When John Dillinger saw the building, he felt a lot better. It was a brick building in a borough of only 4,000 residents. It was just like the Lima, Ohio jail. Sergeant Reynolds couldn't resist getting another dig in. "Well, John, why don't you try making a break? Don't you want to jump out of the car?" Dillinger was so over him. Reporters and curious onlookers swarmed the car, and the outlaw was hustled into the sheriff's office. The Lake County Sheriff was 42-year-old Lillian Hawley. She'd become sheriff after her husband, Roy Hawley, had been killed on the job. She was a competent administrator and had become quite handy with firearms, including machine guns. Her chief deputy was her nephew, Carol Hawley. The sheriff was a smart cookie and had sent her 19-year-old twin daughters, Janice and Janet, to a school out of town before someone as dangerous as Dillinger arrived. Sheriff Hawley wasn't wearing a uniform to welcome John Dillinger to her fine establishment. She chose fabulous and wore a mulberry dress with a white Angora jabot. She offered the lawman refreshments, sandwiches, coffee, and a half-barrel of beer. Dillinger, not allowed to partake, was taken to an isolated cell. The gathered reporters were a bit bummed. They wanted a press conference complete with a photo shoot. Sheriff Hawley was like, "Nah, I'm not feeling it." But Estill, eager to launch his governorship campaign, was like, "Come right along, folks." 20 minutes after his arrival, Dillinger was hauled out of his cell, had his handcuffs removed, and was shoved onto an impromptu red carpet-like event to star in the Estill Show. However, Johnny, chewing a piece of gum, not Estill, was the star of the show. Dressed in dark slacks and vest, a white dress shirt open at the collar, he deftly handled the rapid-fire questions from the eager reporters. Was he glad to see Indiana again? About as glad as Indiana is to see me. Had he smuggled the guns into Indiana State Prison? Dillinger grinned. I'm not denying it. How did he get them in? Another grin. You're too inquisitive. There's no denying that I helped fix up the break at Michigan City last September when 10 men got away. Why not? I stick to my friends, and they stick to me. Photographers shouted for different poses. Reed Thompson called out to Estill, "Bob, put your arm around him." Estill put his arm around Dillinger's waist in a pally sort of way, and Johnny put his elbow on the prosecutor's shoulder, his hands dangling in front. Some said his thumb and forefinger gun was a message to his supporters to take Estill out. No one had to. Just the act of him leaning on Estill, smiling like he was in total control, he committed another murder of the man's career. Then a cameraman started filming and the group posed for newsreel footage. Dillinger threw a mocking smile at Sheriff Hawley on his left, then on his right he grinned to Estill, who looked exhausted and a bit sheepish. He was regretting this call for a photo op. I'll take awkward family photos for $500, Alex. Reporters got all giddy. Johnny was not the usual tight-faced, tough, sneering, grumpy gangster who shielded his face and from whom getting a half-decent quote was like pulling teeth. Dillinger was a wisecracking, headline-making criminal with disarming charm and movie star charisma. He was one of the most wanted men in the country, but the whole thing seemed to be a joke to him. Lawmen and politicians the country over shuddered. This tactic would rally the womenfolk who'd campaigned to save him from the electric chair. Yeah, Johnny knew exactly what he was doing and no one in the room could stop him. Had he really sent the book How to Be a Detective to Matt Leach for Christmas? Dillinger with a twinkle in his eye. Well, I was there when it was sent. Laughs all around. Someone said it was President Roosevelt's birthday today. Dillinger smirked. You can say that I'm for him all the way, and for the NRA, National Recovery Administration, particularly for banks. Fawning laughter. One reporter asked, how long does it take you to go through a bank? Dillinger curled his lip in his soon-to-be infamous half-smile and said, 1 minute and 40 seconds. Flat. He regaled the tale of his capture in Tucson, which he blamed on Makeley and Clark's generosity. He revealed his personal habits. I don't drink much and I smoke very little. When you rob banks, you can't very well do a lot of drinking. I guess my only bad habit is robbing banks. Still, everything he said was calculated. He wanted to make sure people knew John Hamilton's sad fate. Poor Red. He died from the wounds he received in East Chicago. Caught a whole flock of bullets in his stomach. I wasn't with him when he got it, but one of the boys told me about it. I think they dumped his body in the Calumet River. If people bought the tale, Hamilton could prepare his jailbreak in peace. The more Dillinger spoke, the more the reporters fell under his spell. The press always talked about gangsters as rats, cold-blooded killers. Now they were calling John Dillinger a swashbuckling star. A Daily News reporter wrote, "He rates in the eyes of calloused observers as the most amazing specimen of his kind ever seen outside of a wildly imaginative moving picture." But his smile faded when they questioned him about the East Chicago bank robbery. "I never killed O'Malley. I never had anything to do with that stick-up. I was in Florida when the East Chicago job was pulled, and I can prove it. They can't hold me for that." After the half-hour sideshow, Dillinger was finally led away. He had cleverly scored pity points and said, "I'm not a bad fella, ladies and gentlemen. I was just an unfortunate boy who started wrong." Dillinger had given a performance of a lifetime. Now the burning question on all minds was, which great attorney would represent the greatest criminal of the age? John Dillinger soon settled that. He said, "Get me Louis Piquet." Who? John Dillinger had never met Louis Philip Pickett, the flamboyant Chicago municipal prosecutor turned defense attorney. Dillinger always said Piquet. I guess the lawyer never corrected him. Hart was Dillinger's revenge for everyone calling him Dillinger instead of Dillinger. The 49-year-old Pickett never attended law school, but had taught himself while he was chief clerk in the office of Chicago prosecutor Harry B. Miller. He passed the bar exam on his fourth attempt in 1918 and followed up Miller as city prosecutor in 1920. Pickett skirted close to the edge of the law and often attended banquets thrown by mobster Al Capone. He was indicted for fraud but never convicted for anything. In 1923, he switched sides and became a moderately successful criminal defense attorney. Pickett employed his suave and clever stocks and bonds salesman Arthur O'Leary as his assistant, or what we today call a paralegal, though O'Leary called himself an investigator who did a bit of wheeling and dealing on the side. Like Pickett, Art played fast and loose with them pesky laws. While Dillinger was still in Tucson, Meyer Bogue, who'd been incarcerated with John at Michigan City and remained in touch with him, showed up at Pickett's offices in Chicago. He hadn't joined in the escape since he was up for release 3 months later. He told Pickett that he could get him to be Dillinger's lawyer via some underworld contacts. Pickett said, "That would be wonderful if you boys can get me that case. If I land that, it'll make me the most famous lawyer in the United States." Well, we're in for a treat. Pickett, with his crazy white mop of hair, mad speech skills, and charming personality, always enchanted jurors with his overly dramatic courtroom performances. One day, a friend told him to stop defending the hoodlums. Pickett said, "They're the only ones who have money these days." But could someone like Dillinger afford his fee? Louis Pickett and Art O'Leary arrived at the county jail in Crown Point, Indiana. The place was swarming with eager attorneys, all hoping to defend the most infamous prisoner in America. There were several bigwigs among them. The jailhouse looked like it was under siege. Every nook and cranny was filled with police officers gleaned from stations far and wide. Nervous farm boys in National Guard uniforms manned mounted machine guns in the lobby. And then there were the random yahoos who'd left their fields and homesteads armed with old muskets, pitchforks, and baseball bats. Everyone got in each other's way. Warden Louis Baker found Pickett and told him that John Dillinger had been calling for him constantly. He had to search him, sorry. Pickett was like, "That's cool. In fact, search me every time, so everyone knows there's no funny business." Dillinger and the lawyer were allowed to speak in private. Pickett told him that he was in a pickle for sure, and his defense was going to cost a pretty penny. Dillinger's money had been confiscated in Arizona, but he offered to pay the $3,000 he'd left with his father. Pickett smirked. "You're the most talkative criminal in America today. Any lawyer who represents you is gonna get dirtied up plenty. I'd like to help you, but I don't see myself taking all that on for only $3,000. At this moment, Dillinger was handed a telegram from his father saying he was on his way over and would bring Joseph Ryan, a one-armed lawyer from Indianapolis. Pickett was like, "Oh well, good luck." But Dillinger asked him to stick around, please. Pickett did. On that same day, Thursday, February 1st, 1934, the Con train pulled into the Chicago LaSalle Street Terminal. Mary Kinder had already gotten off in Kentucky and had been brought to the women's facility in Indianapolis. Captain John Steege and Sergeant Frank Reynolds plus 100 officers escorted Harry Pierpont, Charles Makeley, and Russell Clark to the Indiana State Prison at Michigan City, awaiting their transfer to Ohio. Upon arrival, the robbers were stripped to their underwear and thrown into solitary confinement on bread and water. Before being shipped off to Ohio, the freezing and starving men were subjected to incessant interrogations from Captain Matt Leach, Warden Lewis Kunkel, and Captain John Steege. Ed Schaus would also be sent along to answer for the death of Sheriff Sarber. Harry Copeland remained in Indiana to be arraigned for the Greencastle bank robbery. With the gang behind bars and off the front pages, Chicago disbanded the 40-man Dillinger Squad, and insurance company detective Forrest Huntington left the Dillinger investigation. Their work was done and other jobs were waiting. Captain Leach had trouble moving on. Dillinger's in jail, but this wasn't over, was it? On Friday, February 2, 1934, John Dillinger Sr. and lawyer Joseph Ryan arrived in Crown Point, and John Dillinger Jr. was re-indicted. They had discovered the initial indictment could have cleared him. On Monday, February 5th, the little criminal courtroom at Crown Point was packed with hundreds of spectators, reporters, and photographers to hear Dillinger arraigned for trial by Judge William Murray. Everyone had been searched before entering. Rumors flew that John Hamilton and several carloads of gangsters were in town preparing to spring Dillinger. Just to be safe, Mrs. Hawley added 6 National Guardsmen in and around the jail. One reporter wrote that the place was now nigh impregnable as the Rock of Gibraltar. With 50 guards lining the courtroom, the shackled prisoner was brought in by 4 men armed with machine guns. Dillinger, his mustache shaved off, dressed in a fashionable white shirt and the vest of his blue serge suit, looked like a movie star. Women swooned. Johnny reveled in their gasps. Pickett and O'Leary sat in the front benches as spectators. Dillinger's lawyer Ryan seemed clueless. His low voice was barely audible in the courtroom. He filed for a writ of habeas corpus, since Dillinger was actually a law-abiding citizen of the state of Arizona. The man had lived there for 3 days. The petition was denied. Ryan then moved for a continuance, which was granted until Friday. The disaster wiped the smirk off Dillinger's face, and he demanded to see Pickett. The lawyer arrived in the cell, but he figured the place was wired and selected another cell. During the talk, he kept tapping a coin on the table to mess up any dictaphone recordings. Dillinger was nervous. Ryan had screwed up everything. Pickett tried to calm him down. Ryan wasn't so bad, but Dillinger demanded he represent him from now on. "You got money?" "Lots. Just give me a minute to get it to you." Pickett agreed. On February 9th, it was time for John Dillinger's arraignment. Bring on the Lewis Pickett Theater Show. The fluffy white ball of energy was on his feet, constantly fighting every point raised, and royally pissed off prosecutor Estill and Judge Murray. The reporters, spectators, and armed guards were delighted. This was gold. Anybody brought any popcorn? But none were as delighted as Dillinger. He'd been escorted out in heavy shackles, with the machine gunners poking him in the back. Pickett instantly protested. "Your Honor, are we to have a hearing in accord with the spirit of the laws of this state and of this nation, or are we to witness merely a mockery in the name of justice? Is the state to be permitted to continue inciting an atmosphere of prejudice and hatred? The very air reeks with the bloody rancor of intolerant malice. The clanging of shackles brings to our minds the dungeons of the czars, and not the flag-bedecked liberty of an American courtroom. I request the court to direct that those shackles be removed." Prosecutor Estill objected. "This is a very dangerous man, Your Honor." Judge Murray ordered, "Remove the handcuffs from the prisoner. Win Pickett." "Thank you. May I also point out to Your Honor that this is a civil court and not a military court-martial? Could anything be more prejudicial than machine guns pressed into the defendant's back and an army of guards cluttering up the room? May the court direct that all the guns be removed from the courtroom?" Deputy Sheriff Carol Hawley rushed forward. "I'm responsible for the safeguarding of the prisoner." Pickett thundered, "Who are you? Are you a lawyer? What right have you to address the court?" The judge ordered Hawley to sit down. "Take those machine guns out of this court. Win Pickett." Pickett demanded a delay of 30 days and a date set in March to prepare his defense and get witnesses out of Michigan and Florida. When Estill demanded the trial start in 10 days, Pickett went ballistic. Could it be that a political campaign is approaching? That man's life is at stake. There is a law in Indiana against lynching, and to go to trial so soon would be legal murder. The defense must have more time. Estill shouted back, "There's a law against murder too. Then why don't you observe it? Why don't you call back your men with their machine guns? Why don't you stand Dillinger against the wall and shoot him down? There's no need to throw away the state's money on this kind of mockery. Why isn't John Dillinger entitled to the consideration of a hearing? Your Honor, even Christ had a fairer trial than this." Judge Murray compromised and scheduled the hearing for March 12th. Win Pickett, sort of. Estill said bitterly, "Your Honor, why don't you let Mr. Pickett take Dillinger home with him and bring him back on the day of the trial? You've given him everything else he's asked for." Rumors swirled around Indiana that Lou Pickett was billing hours for John Dillinger's escape instead for his defense. With jailbreaks being all the rage these days, Prosecutor Estill and Sheriff Hawley got nervous. Perhaps their celebrity crook was better off in the Indiana State Prison. Blood drained from Dillinger's face when he heard of the plan. "Don't let them take me to Michigan City. I never want to see that place again. I want you to fight this thing for me," Pickett assured him. "Of course I'll fight it. Quit worrying. You're not going to Michigan City." However, on February 12th, 6 police cars arrived in Crown Point to transfer the prisoner to Indiana State Prison. Sheriff Hawley was all set to sign the transfer papers in front of Judge Murray and Pickett when the lawyer casually asked the sheriff, "I think that's a very nice jail you have. What makes you think there's anything wrong with it?" Blam! Right in Mrs. Hawley's professional pride. "There isn't anything wrong with it. It's the strongest jail in Indiana." "That's what I thought. But of course I don't want to embarrass Mrs. Hawley. I appreciate that she's a woman, and if she's afraid of an escape..." "I'm not afraid of an escape. I can take care of John Dillinger or any other prisoner." Mrs. Hawley now demanded Dillinger be left with her. Pickett then told Estill and the judge that he didn't want to add more travel time to defend his client, who'd already been moved in and out of jurisdictions enough. If the jail was as escape-proof as the sheriff claimed, John should stay. And he ended with the zinger, "If you're not capable of giving him a fair trial here, I intend to ask for a change of venue." Those words kill careers. Judge Murray denied Estill's transfer request, saying it would be an insult to Sheriff Hawley, women everywhere, and Lake County. 100 men couldn't release the outlaw from such a jail. Win Pickett. Hawley once more upped the defenses around the jail and called in the Indiana National Guard's 113th Engineers. The soldiers, stationed at the jail, brought Browning automatic rifles with bulletproof vest-piercing rounds. Then Hawley told Pickett he couldn't bring any witnesses into the jail to meet with his client. This was a problem. Witnesses needed to identify Dillinger and testify that the gangster had been sunbathing in Florida on the day of Sergeant O'Malley's murder. When Mrs. Hawley wasn't about to budge, Pickett threw his hands in the air. "Fine, the trial will be transferred to a less prejudiced location then." "No, not our careers!" Harry Copeland was transferred to Greencastle to face charges for the bank robbery he confessed to, but hadn't been involved in. However, he didn't make a statement and didn't answer questions. When security concerns were raised, he was quickly shipped back to Michigan City. Mary Kinder's trial also fell apart. She'd been held on a $25,000 bond, which her lawyer, Jesse Levi, protested was too prohibitive. Judge Frank Baker lashed out. "I want this bond to be prohibitive. If Mrs. Kinder got out of jail, she's dumb enough to run around the country with a bunch of machine gunners." However, there was no evidence she aided and abetted escaped convicts, and the charges were dropped. Meanwhile, on February 11th, Harry Pierpont, Charles Makeley, and Russell Clark signed extradition waivers to Ohio. They'd rather be on death row than spend another minute in that hellhole that was Indiana State Prison. On February 15, 1934, the trio were arraigned before Judge Emmett Everett at Lima, Ohio, mere yards away from the place where they beat up the sheriff. All three pleaded not guilty. They were granted separate trials. Pierpont's trial was first and would start on May 6th. Meanwhile, in Crown Point, Indiana, Lou Pickett tried to get Billy Frechette into the jail to see John Dillinger. Sheriff Lillian Hawley blocked her. Pickett made a huge stink about it to the press. His client's civil rights were thrown to the dogs. He demanded a change of venue now. To ensure headlines for his threat, he explained that he had hired a professional race car driver to prove it was impossible to drive from Florida to East Chicago in 23 hours. The next day, Art O'Leary met John Dillinger for the first time to discuss the investigator's trip to Florida. As the lawyer and investigator were about to leave, Dillinger slipped Art a note, tightly rolled up and wound with a rubber band. For Billy. O'Leary discreetly let Pickett know about the note, and the lawyer said, "It's probably a mushy love note. You better let me have it. They're liable to search you when we go out, but they can't touch me." Pickett bent down to pretend to lace his shoe and slipped the note inside. In the car on the way back to Chicago, the lawyer read the meticulously folded brown piece of paper. It was a mushy love note, a message for John Hamilton, a complete floor plan of the Crown Point jail, and detailed instructions for an escape. Hamilton had to swoop into Crown Point with other members of the gang, dynamite the brickwork of the southwest corner of the jail, then use blowtorches to cut the steel. It would take minutes. Bring machine guns to keep the guards at bay. Best time was 11 a.m., when he was out of his cell. Pickett and O'Leary looked at each other. Oh no. Should they give it to Frechette, hand it over to Warden Baker, or burn it? Well, Dillinger would find out that Frechette never got it, so they decided to give it to her and convince her the plan was impossible. On February 17th, Dillinger asked Pickett to bring along Meyer Bogue. He had a few things to discuss. Pickett asked Sheriff Hawley, but she refused. Pickett asked Prosecutor Estill, but he refused. So Pickett asked Judge Murray and told him, "Bogue is an old friend of Dillinger. He knew him in the university." "I was not aware that Dillinger had attended a university. What did he study?" "I think it was shirt making." Everyone laughed. Murray agreed to let Bogue see Dillinger, though they had to be separated by a screen. Dillinger told Bogue that Red was in no shape to come get him yet. Homer Van Meter was busy with Babyface Nelson, though the duo promised to help any way they could, but time was running out. Could Bogue bribe someone to get a gun inside? Bogue was unable to find anyone willing to risk their job. O'Leary then suggested they should smuggle in a fake gun. He'd read about a prisoner in the Wisconsin State Penitentiary, Earl Loveday, who had tried to escape with a wooden gun a few months earlier. His plan was foiled by an alert deputy, but they could try that. If Dillinger was caught, he could just say he'd carved the gun in his cell so no one would get in trouble. Johnny hesitated, but he was out of options and agreed. Pickett tried to convince Johnny to drop the escape plan. There was enough reasonable doubt to avoid trial. He'd found several witnesses from Florida who testified that Dillinger had been in Daytona Beach at the time of the East Chicago job. Please wait to see what happens at trial before executing a cockamamie breakout. Dillinger considered. Nah, a breakout is better. On February 26, 1934, Judge William Murray and Sheriff Lillian Hawley finally agreed to allow John Dillinger's family, friends, and potential witnesses to visit him, but only if Lewis Pickett stopped threatening them with a venue change. The first visitor escorted across the Bridge of Sighs was a dark-haired, heavily made-up, intoxicated woman identified only as Mrs. John Dillinger. But she couldn't just walk into the jail. Sheriff Hawley forced her to strip buck naked and did a cavity search. The mystery woman was Billy Frechette, of course. Pickett distracted the guards with small talk so Billy and Johnny could talk freely. A jailer claimed he overheard them speaking in code. But this was the stuff of detective novels, not reality. Billy told Dillinger that Red Hamilton thought it was too risky to dynamite the jail. He preferred a regular assault like in Lima, Ohio. Meanwhile, the feds, sticking their noses in where it didn't belong yet, were trying to figure out if John Hamilton was still alive. Rumors had it his new girl, Pat Charrington, was nursing him back to health somewhere, so they picked her up to have a little chat. While Pickett was convinced his witnesses could exonerate John, Pat dug Dillinger's grave. She told the G-men about John Dillinger's frantic search for an underworld doctor to treat injured Hamilton a few hours after the East Chicago job. Girl! Well, at least Blabbermouth Charrington was smart enough not to reveal her lover's hideout address. Now Estill had evidence Dillinger hadn't been in Florida. Pickett's bluff was up. John Dillinger was toast. With the terror gang out of commission, the director of the Bureau of Investigation, J. Edgar Hoover, was left twiddling his thumbs. Worse, with the Kansas City Massacre unsolved and the William Ham and Edward Bremer abductors still unidentified, the Bureau's amazing win after the Charles Urschel kidnapping looked like a mere fluke. President Roosevelt's federal anti-crime bills were all but destroyed in Congress because conservative Southern legislators insisted such laws would do violence to the state's rights. With the terror gang behind bars due to good local policing, authorities felt all was well with the world again and didn't need a Justice Department's Interstate Criminal Apprehension Program. Who needs a federal police which could turn into Gestapo, anyone? So, the Roosevelt administration's 12-point program of federal crime control was dead in the water. If Hoover wanted to prove his bureau was necessary and get his agents more powers, he desperately needed a celebrity interstate bank robber like John Dillinger roaming free about the country. Well, Hoover was about to get his wish. Find out in the next episode. See you there.